Outside the cave, it was still snowing heavily. A thick layer of ice covered the riverside, and now few people from the tribe would go outside. One could only see a boundless piece of white if he looked afar in the distance. Inside the cave, there was a bonfire burning, and the atmosphere, unlike old times, heated up. After they installed the ice blocks on those vents, to prevent wind from entering the cave through the holes, the cave was much brighter than before, and they did not have to suffer from the cold wind as well. Those feelings were new to all the kids, so 2 days in a row, they were in a mood of extreme excitement. All of them sat around the fire and discussed about the letters and numbers written on the stone wall. Yes, Xiaoshuan had copied all the words and numbers in the animal skin roll that were left behind by the old hunter in charge of teaching and wrote them on the stone wall. With the light in the day, they would see those words and numbers clearly without any fire. If they could memorize and master all that was written on the wall, the old hunter would not have to start from the very beginning the next time he comes. Unlike the others, Xiaoshuan had been staying at that stone room and carefully wiping out those stone powders all day long, except when it was time for eating. Xiaoshuan had moved all sundries in that stone room to other places, for the fresco on the wall was pretty large in size. Xiaoshuan stood up and took a deep breath after the whole fresco had finally been cleared. He moved his arms and legs to ease the sore and ache before he took a few steps back to look at the picture on the stone wall with the light that poured in. Since it was not so bright inside, Xiaoshuan still needed to rely on the torch to observe the details of the fresco, for some parts of it were not distinct enough. Aside from the 2 pictures that Xiaoshuan saw in the first place, there were some more astonishing pictures hidden behind the layer of stone powder. The pictures covered agriculture and stock breeding as well. Look at those men working on a field, and those who were whipping up the sheep. There was someone in a fancy leather robe holding an exquisite wine cup with complex fancy patterns. There were some women picking up fruits as they held baskets in their arms. There was even someone riding a horse. In one picture there was a man riding on horseback with a kid. Next to it, there was a picture describing a hunting mission or a war, which was relatively larger than others, and took nearly half of the wall. In its front there was a tall horse, on its back sat a sturdy warrior who was obviously stronger than the others, with feather decorations on his head. His head raised up high to show his imposing appearance. Perhaps he was the leader of the group. Around and behind the sturdy warrior, there were a few men on horseback riding with him. Beside them, there were some wolves. No, they were not wolves. Compared with Caesar, the animals on the picture had long and upturned tails. Some of them even had curvy tails. They were probably hounds. Some of the hounds revealed their tongues with their mouths open, as if breathing heavily. Another 2 inclined their head to those men on horseback, as if listening to someone's words. In the background of the painting, there were some buildings, which were far bigger and taller than those that Xiaoshuan had seen in the tribe. He heard that people up on the mountain had better living conditions. Xiaoshuan imagined in his mind based on the information he had heard, and he figured that even the houses up in the mountain could not be compared to those mansions in the fresco. He moved his sight back to the first picture that he saw. Inside it there was a woman with fine decorations on her head. They were not as rough and simple as those decorations that women in the tribe were wearing. Instead, they were more delicate and exquisite. As for the pot that the woman was holding, if these pots with complex decorative patterns were not stone pots, what were they? Xiaoshuan thought about one possibility: pottery. How long had these pictures existed? If they were the same age as the stone room, then they should be at least hundreds or even thousands years old. Before 1,000 years, there was agriculture like stock breeding and farming. Even pottery existed, and hunting tools were in an unimaginable variety. They even had hounds, real hounds. Unlike Caesar, who was merely a wolf, brought back and kept by a human accidentally. Xiaoshuan suppressed the shock in his mind, and kept looking. The fresco on the left had obvious differences from the fresco on the right part of the stone wall. In the middle that distinguished the left from the right, there were only abstract lines and shapes. So abstract that Xiaoshuan could not understand. It seemed messy at first look, and Xiaoshuan could not speculate its meaning by other pictures as well. However, what was obvious was that after these lines and shapes, the style of the fresco had changed very much. It fell down sharp with a feeling of loss from the earlier strong confidence. Many pictures were portraying something bleak and desolate. Women kneeled down on the ground, weeping. Kids were standing up straight, with blank and lost looks, as if they had no idea of anything. The background was not filled with those mansions, but the cave that Xiaoshuan was living in. There was no more agriculture as farming and stock breeding. No more pictures about 3 or 5 women carrying baskets to gather food. No more riding and shooting, no more hounds, and no more pottery, whose workmanship was much more delicate than stoneware. However, both the left and the right part of the fresco on the stone wall, there was a logo carved above the picture, the tribal totem. The tribal totem of the Scorching Horn tribe looked like the two horns of Diceverhinus, which was a rhinoceros with two horns. But the horns were longer, with flames around them, just like the name of the tribe tried to describe. So, was it showing the life of the Scorching Horn tribe? Xiao Xuan recalled that archaeologist from his last life, who had said that basically, frescoes and paintings on the wall described the daily lives of men of that age, or their fantasies and hopes, which was also a kind of spiritual sustenance of mankind at that time. The pictures carved on the stone walls of that room were absolutely no imaginary scenes. The emotions filled up in the images was so intense. Only true experiences and real things could arouse deeper, richer, and more intense emotions of people. What had happened in the tribe? Natural disasters. Man-caused calamity. Or both fell on the tribe. At the end of the fresco on the stone wall, there were a lot of palm-sized pictures in various styles. Take the one on the upper left for example, it had a spider resting on its net. Or the one on the right end, there were plants like bamboos or something. In one picture, there was even something as a mask, it was so creepy to look at. In those pictures there were plants, animals, and many things that went beyond Xiao Xuan's wildest imagination. Just as Xiao Xuan fixed his attention on those frescoes, he heard someone calling for him. Ah Xuan. Come quickly, Ah Xuan. Uncle Ji is here. The other kids had no interest in the depth of the cave. For all those years they lived inside, aside from coming to a certain place to poop, they never went into deeper places. Those parts were never their thing and they got over it once they had gone once into the depth of the cave. Therefore, the kid calling for Xiao Xuan did not go towards him, but shouted directly at him. Coming back to reality, Xiao Xuan realized that today was indeed the food delivery day for Ji. This time, Ji also brought 3 days' worth food at one time. When Xiao Xuan saw him, he still had quite some snowflakes on his coat that hadn't melted yet. However, Ji cared no more about the snow, but kept staring at those vents with the ice blocking them. He played around with the stone plate in his hands as he stared, and obviously, he hadn't expected that something like that was stored in the cave. Ever since he was in charge of food delivery, the cave had always been dark during wintertime. In the past, he had heard from someone else that there was similar stuff in the cave, but he never thought the kids would use it. In addition, since it was messy and chaotic in the orphan cave, he did not bother to do anything more. Nevertheless, unexpectedly he saw that they used them here today. Xiao Xuan asked the other kids to help unload the food. Now with a sufficient food supply, the kids in the cave did not act like old times, where they fight over everything, especially when it came to food. Hearing Xiao Xuan's words, all the kids came to help, and then Xiao Xuan distributed the food to different groups. He was no more his worry after the food was distributed to group leaders, for they would decide how to distribute to different people. That day, Xiao Xuan did not let Ji to leave immediately. Instead, he asked him to tell stories about the tribe to the kids. Ji did not have any other plans after the food was delivered anyways. Xiao Xuan merely wanted to learn more information from Ji and see if the stories in Ji's description could tell him a thing or two about the frescoes in that stone wall. It was too bad that Ji's stories were no different from the stories he heard from Lang Ga in the past. He did not get the information he wanted to hear. Xiao Xuan drew something on the wall with a carbonated branch. He knew that Ji had glimpsed at his picture and saw what was on it. However, he acted all the same, with no abnormal behavior. Obviously, Ji did not know what the picture was. What Xiao Xuan drew was just one of those varied pictures that were on the right side of the stone wall of the stone room. Ji was considered as an experienced warrior in the tribe, and he did not recognize that picture. Xiao Xuan sighed at heart, for it seemed to be very difficult if he wanted to know more about the things in the fresco. At the end of the fresco on the right part of the stone wall in that room, under those various pictures, there was a sentence. However, Xiao Xuan could not connect them to a whole sentence because he did not know a few words in it. Even though Xiao Xuan could speak the language fluently, he was not familiar with many words and letters. He planned to ask for the help of that old hunter, the next time when the old hunter came. Xiao Xuan will ask him about the meaning of those words, and learn them all when he had the opportunity. About 10 days later, that old hunter finally came down the mountain again and showed up his face in the cave again. Seeing that there were so many changes in the cave, he was shocked and surprised to know that these kids in the cave had made much progress. He was quite pleased, so he took out another animal skin roll, ready to teach something new. In the spare time of teaching, Xiao Xuan consulted a few words from him. Not all the words he asked were from the stone wall. He mixed some other words in, because Xiao Xuan did not want to raise the old hunter's suspicion. However, it turned out that Xiao Xuan had thought too much. The old hunter had high interest in teaching and nothing else. He merely assumed that Xiao Xuan had seen those words from somewhere, and then he taught him one by one, quite patiently and eager. After that, the old hunter even praised Xiao Xuan. Those words are written down well, with a certain momentum. You will turn out to be a brave warrior. Xiao Xuan smiled about it and did not reply. The words that were praised were from the stone wall. He copied them, so even though they were not exactly the same with the original ones, they carried some of the original charm and style, because they were copied. Judging from that, the one who left those pictures and words on the stone wall in that room should probably be a warrior, a tough and strong one. After the old hunter had left, Xiao Xuan copied all the things in the old hunter's newly left animal skin roll, so that the kids might review from time to time. Then he went to the stone room again. After mastering those words, Xiao Xuan finally understood the meaning of that sentence. One day, we shall return to our previous land. Glory is still in the fire, and the fire of scorching horn will never be put out. After that sentence, there was a big word Zan. Perhaps that's the name of the master of that stone room, and the one who carved all those pictures and the sentence. The final sentence was deeply carved into the wall, much deeper than any other picture, especially the last few words. From that, one could easily see the intense emotion of the person when he left the sentence on the ground. Even though Xiao Xuan still did not know why it was painted by stone powder, he felt appreciative to get the opportunity to see them. In addition, he admired the one who left those words for him to see. From that sentence, it was easily implied that his situation or the whole tribe's situation was not good, or even depressing. But they did not give up. Even if the situation was in despair, it meant that hope was still there as long as one was still alive, as long as the tribe was still there. Xiao Xuan held the carbonated branch and drew a simple image of thumbs up behind the word Zan. He just gave him a thumbs up. Xiao Xuan spent every day in the stone room, trying to memorize all those pictures on the right side of the stone wall. He also learned to paint, thinking that perhaps it might be useful in the future. He had nothing else to do anyway. Since every kid had stored enough fish, together with the food and firewood from the tribe, they had a nice winter. With the common used herbs that Ji gave to Xiao Xuan, there were no accidents as well. As days went by, it was quite calm. Wintertime passed faster than they imagined. 2 days ago, a younger kid caught a cold and he had a fever. Xiao Xuan cooked the herbs from Ji and poured the soup down his throat. After only 2 days, his condition stabilized. He only had to survive those few days. With a bad health, none of the herbs would have been effective. He might have been as dead as the former owner of Xiao Xuan's body, before anyone could call for help from the others. Luckily, during the time before winter, all of the children became healthier. They had constantly exercised and had much better food and provision, so they did not get ill as easily as before. Inside the stone room, Xiao Xuan had placed an animal fur mat down on the ground. Sometimes he would just sleep right in front of the wall, if he worked too late on those frescoes. He painted pictures with his fingers on the ground. After a picture was finished, Xiao Xuan signed it. Winter had passed 2/3 of its duration, and they had only 20 to 30 days left. If they survived these last days, they would have a better living situation. Xiao Xuan felt listless and that his body was moldy with rust since he had spent so much time indoors. As he was thinking, Caesar, who was lying beside him, moved his ears and looked towards the entrance of the stone room. Then Xiao Xuan heard the voice of Ji. Today was not the day that Ji was supposed to deliver food. Or was it that spending so much time in the stone room messed up his brain? Filled with curiosity, Xiao Xuan walked out of the stone room and went to see what happened. Uncle Ji, what brings you here today? Xiao Xuan took a look at the triangles that he drew on the wall to keep track of time. Because Ji would come every 3 days, Xiao Xuan did not use the character Zhang, which contains 5 strokes. Instead, he drew triangles on the wall. Now the last triangle missed 1 stroke, so that meant Ji was only supposed to come by tomorrow. Ji, standing next to the bonfire, shook the snowflakes off his coat and then took out a roll of animal skin. I'm here for some kids. Gather all the names on this roll, who are older than 11. Xiao Xuan took the animal skin roll and had a look. On it there were 7 names, including Ba and 2. Those 2 kids suddenly got sparkling eyes and they stared at him hopefully, as if they thought of something. The names on that animal skin roll were all those that Xiao Xuan knew, so he gathered them around, including those 2 who were taking a nap. The 2 kids that got woken up by force were still sleepy, but when they saw Ji and those few kids standing beside him, they suddenly came to their minds and instantly stopped rubbing their eyes. Instead, the kids quickly gathered their things and rushed towards Ji with big smiles on their faces. Ji's sight hesitated on the fish teeth necklaces hanging from these 7 kids' necks, and he carefully checked all their name palettes. On normal days he was in charge of food delivery, so he had some impressions about the kids in the orphan cave. But this time, one could never be too careful. He had to check and make sure. Yes, exactly 7. Ji tossed each kid a leather cloak after he had rolled the animal skin back. Wear them and follow me later. Mower, you come with me, too. Mower was only 10 years old, but he would turn 11 after this winter. At Ji's command, Mower got dressed and carried his knife. Unlike the other kids' admiration or excitement, Mower walked towards Ji calmly, as if he had expected it. Fine. Ashwen, you can go back to sleep now. I'll take them out. Tomorrow I'll come back with the food. Ji lifted the straw curtain and left with the 8 kids. Xiao Xuan lifted the thick straw curtain a little and the icy wind pouring and made his eyes feel a stabbing pain. His sight was blurred but he could still see the thick layer of snow outside the cave and the path that was created by Ji. On both sides of the path, the snow was higher than the kids walking on the path. Their thin figures were trembling in the cold, but they followed Ji closely, with no hesitation and no intention to turn back their heads. Instead they were eager to leave. Dropping the straw curtain, Xiao Xuan came back into the cave. The kids left behind were no longer sleepy as they stared at the fire, blankly. Xiao Xuan knew why. After winter, there would be a snow festival and some sacramental activities. The most important thing during the sacramental activities was the annual totemic awakening. One would turn a totemic warrior if one could awaken his totemic power, or else one must wait for another year. Normally, kids over 10 years old would be sent up the mountain for pre-selection, before winter's end. The shaman would keep those kids with high odds to have their totemic powers awakened, and send the other kids back. However, compared with other kids in the tribe, most kids in Orphan Cave had poor health, so they would be postponed a year on the pre-selection, which was 11 years old. Mower was an exception, for he was not considered an orphan. He was in much better fitness than others because of his constant training and practicing. The kids following up with Ji must be quite excited and anxious. All of them expect to be chosen by the shaman, for as long as they got chosen, they had a 90% chance to awaken their totemic powers this time, else they would awaken their totemic power next year with 100% certainty. Xiao Xuan was only 9 now, and he would only turn 10 after winter. It was still too early for him, so after Ji had left, he told the kids to approach him if anything happened. Then he went back to continue working on the frescoes, in the stone room. After 4 days, when Ji was delivering food again, he brought back 4 upset kids. Tu and Ba were among those who had been sent back. The eldest kids were kept. Being 13 years old already, they were naturally kept. Turning 14 after the winter, it would be abnormal if they did not awaken their totemic powers by then. The former leader of the cave was also a 13-year-old, and he knew someone living on the mountainside. During this winter he was preparing for training. Most warriors believed that before one awakened his totemic power, the stronger he was, the stronger he would become. So Ku asked some family to take him in during wintertime. He would be better fed, and learn some experience from other totemic warriors. It was far better than staying in the cave. And that was also the reason why Ku went up to the mountain early instead of spending the winter in Orphan Cave. Don't be upset. Sooner or later you will become totemic warriors. Perhaps next year. Ji comforted the 4 sad kids, and left after he dropped off the food. I envy those who were chosen by the shaman. They can listen to the shaman's lecture, said one of the kids brought back by Ji. Hey, what did the shaman say to you? The other kids got around, asking curiously. The shaman. 1 minute earlier, the 4 kids were drooping their heads. But on that word, they raised their heads up at a 45-degree angle, and inside their eyes was admiration and respect. Xiao Xuan curled his lips inside. Lectures. More of a brainwashing. That old wizard. Xiao Xuan could only curse in his mind. He was not stupid enough to say it out loud. See those 4 kids? Only a few days spent with that old wizard, they got a complete brainwashing. After that little episode, the life inside went back to normal. Even though Tu and Ba were still upset, life continued. During a night, when Xiao Xuan was in the midst of sleeping, he dreamt about 2 crescent moons, melted snow, ice and fire until he heard shouting, and the shouting got louder and louder, and that woke him up from his dreams. The sound was not coming from the children in the cave, but from people outside. An older child listened carefully after he woke up, and suddenly he became very cheerful. It must be the end of the winter. Xiao Xuan yawned and tightened the blanket, wrapping it around him. It was still night, and the fire had long been put out. Nothing could be seen, and only the discussions among the kids could be heard. Xiao Xuan asked Caesar to lead him to the entrance. Lifting some thick straw curtains, Xiaoxuan could hear the shouting more clearly, which were obviously filled with excitement and joy. Regardless of the icy wind, Xiaoxuan looked up in the sky. Snow stopped falling, and the long-disappeared moon showed their appearance once again. Even though they were only outlines of crescent moons, they brought a lot of hope and a dynamic atmosphere. Winter had ended, and the sacramental activities of the snow festival were scheduled. Guess how many people would become totemic warriors? That was the common question of people in the tribe, and almost all of them were thinking about that as they shouted out their joy. Everywhere in the tribe there was someone standing on the roof and staring at the sky, totally ignoring the icy wind. Just as they stopped excitedly shouting and began discussing about the coming snow festival, they heard a child's voice from the orphan cave. The moons came out, yeah, how joyful, yeah, so joyful, yeah, 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 yeah. The lyrics from that song came true. Xiaoxuan had an urge to slap himself in the face for singing that stupid song. When the sun came out and the snow melted, Ji, together with some men, blocked the kids' way when they were holding the fishing tools, intending to rush to the riverside to go fishing. Seeing Ji's familiar smile, and looking at the men Ji brought, the kids finally realized what he was up to. FCK. Every year when winter ended and before the opening of the rituals of the snow festival, they would be dragged to the stream to take a bath. The most annoying bath. If put it in an elegant way, it was required to take a bath before tribal rituals. While the realistic situation was that those who were unwilling to go take a bath themselves would be carried to the stream and be given a brush bath by force. Looking at the warriors that Ji brought, one had to be brushed anyway. Luckily, Xiaoxuan wanted to take a bath. Throughout the winter, he hadn't even washed his face a single time, and his hair became a sticky mess long ago. If Ji had not mentioned it, he would have never imagined how he looked like now. Xiaoxuan walked towards the stream and looked at his reflection in the water. The image was blurred by ripples, but still, he could roughly see that he looked disheveled. Strong and powerful warriors could jump directly into the freezing cold stream, but it was totally different for kids. Ji had told someone to boil some water before they arrived so that the warriors could mix the hot water with the cold stream water in a ladle and then pour it on the naked whelp that was being pinned down on a flat stone. At the same time, they used something like grass vines to scrub his body constantly. Together with every single scrub, streams of black water would flow down. Those whelps were just as dirty as mud. Poured on with water and scrubbed by grass vines, those who had completely experienced the whole process would be tossed to the haystack on the side. Someone would wrap them in clean animal skins and carry them back into the orphan cave. The animal skin that they had used to wear and the blankets they used to wrap on were also taken away by women in the tribe. They would be sent back after they were washed and dried. Xiaoxuan's eyelids twitched seeing this. He felt like that he was in a meat processing factory. Seeing Ji approaching, Xiaoxuan said immediately, "Give me a ladle and I'll do it myself." Since Xiaoxuan was willing to comply, Ji tossed him a ladle and then focused his attention on the other kids. None of the kids who had survived the winter could escape from this. After being washed and scrubbed, the kids back in the cave were told that the snow festival rituals would be held the day after tomorrow. That was the shaman's decision, so naturally no one would complain, let alone reject it. It was thus clear to see how successful that old wizard's brainwashing was. Even after being toyed around like that, they did not have the slightest bit of complaint towards shaman. 3 days after winter was over, the thick layer of snow by the entrance of the cave had melted away quickly. Of course, the ice covers in the vents lasted no longer either. But as the winter ended, the temperature rose quickly. So if covered with animal skin blankets, one would not feel too cold. Everything seemed to be vivid again. The deepest impression that these 2 days left on Xiaoxuan was that many people who used to pay no attention to their appearances and were as slovenly as beggars suddenly cleaned themselves up and were appropriately dressed up. Even if their clothes of animal skins were no good in quality with holes here and there, they were at least clean and tidy. Also, their hair, long or short, was carefully combed. At the very day of the snow festival, all the kids were sleeping in the cave. The rituals wouldn't be starting until the night, and now they were not permitted to go fishing by the river. So they continued sleeping, as someone would come and wake them up when it was time. The straw curtain of the cave was lifted, and Ji, coming from the outside, shouted out towards those sleeping kids, "Okay, boys. Get up and get prepared. We need to go up the mountain." Xiaoxuan hardly recognized Ji when he first saw him. Now Ji was wearing a pair of horns from some fierce animal, and around his neck, there were a few animal bone necklaces. Also, the animal skin clothes he was wearing were not the usual ones. The patterns on them were very clear, and the fur stood out like steel needles. They looked the opposite of soft, as the fur was probably from some ferocious beast. Aside from different clothes, Ji painted some patterns on his face with plant pigment. On both his cheeks there were outlines similar to their tribal totem. On his forehead, nose and jaw, there were also painted lines. Every time when a hunting team was on a mission, totemic warriors would paint those symbols on their faces. Although totemic lines would show up on their bodies when hunting, painting on the face before hunting became a traditional custom as well as a ceremony. Now it was the same with rituals. Seriously speaking, it was Xiao Xuan's first time to attend a ritual. When he woke up at this place, it had passed the ritual seasons, and in his memories there were no related experiences. It felt new and novel. All the kids in the cave were pretty excited about the rituals, for such an event required the attendance of all the people in the tribe, no matter where they lived and who they were. From residents in the mountain top to people in Mountain Foot District, from the strongest warriors to the infants crying piteously for food, all must go up to the top and attend the ceremony. It was the symbol of a year's beginning, as well as the most joyful event every year. The ritual location was at the top of the mountain, near to Shaman's residence. Xiao Xuan followed everyone out of the cave and left Caesar inside. It grew dark as night would soon fall. The active night swallows from the winter seemed to have noticed something, so they hid their tracks as Xiao Xuan saw none tonight. As they were marching to the top, Xiao Xuan saw others climbing up the mountain in groups. They were all dressed up. On their heads, there were antlers, horns, feathers, and some other decorations that Xiao Xuan could not recognize. Around their necks, there were ugly necklaces made from ferocious beasts. Look at those animal teeth on their necklaces. The ones that the kids in the orphan cave were wearing were no comparison to them. All totemic warriors, men and women had painted the same lines on their faces as the ones on Ji's face. Xiao Xuan saw a female warrior whose head was decorated with multicolored feathers. Around her neck were a few bone necklaces, and on her waist was a belt made from some kind of snakes, with gorgeous patterns. Also, there were bones hanging down her leather skirt as ornaments, that collided with each other and created clicking sounds while she walked. Ji said that she was a tough female warrior and she had a high reputation in their tribe. Other women around all showed admiration and respect, seeing the decorations on her. Compared to them, Xiao Xuan and his companions looked like some thin chicks walking around a group of man-faced King Kongs. Xiao Xuan also saw other kids in the tribe. Whether they were from the Mountain Foot District, Mountainside District, or lived up near the Mountaintop District, those kids were dressed like the adults, just less impressive to Xiao Xuan. But what was obvious was that, the higher they lived, the more advanced were their decorations. The kid walking along with that tough female warrior was as proud as a peacock. With a look of "What crappy things are you wearing?" Xiao Xuan's eyes twitched and he looked away from that direction, only to find that all the whelps in the cave around him had sparkling eyes, staring at those kids with advanced decorations jealously. All around was so aggressive, so fierce. Wild and mysterious, all was covered in intense colors of the wilderness. Xiao Xuan's expression stayed stiff all the time. That was the first time that he felt himself living in a primitive tribe so clearly. This was Xiao Xuan's first trip to the mountaintop. In the tribe, people with higher position would also live higher near the top. As they were closer to the mountaintop, Xiao Xuan realized that the kids around, and those warriors leading their way ahead, including Ji, had lost their casualty as they went and became much more serious and reserved. When Xiao Xuan and his companions arrived, there were already a lot of people gathered around the fire pit. People living in Mountain Foot District stood relatively far from the fire pit. In fact, they were standing according to their living positions. The higher they lived in the mountain, the nearer they stood to the fire pit. Luckily, even though they stood far from the center, the spot they stood on was a high terrain, so one could also barely see the situation by the fire pit. How many people did the tribe have in total? In the past he was not sure, but now, Xiao Xuan had an estimation. Today's ceremony required all people in the tribe to attend. You had to come even if you were ill in bed or had trouble walking. Xiao Xuan calculated roughly and found out that the population of the tribe should be no less than 1,000, probably around 1,500. Over 1,000 people did not seem to be very much in Xiao Xuan's eyes, but since he came to the tribe, it was his first time seeing so many people, so it was a lively day for him. On the mountaintop, there was an empty ground, in the center of which there was a crater. And in the center of the crater, there was a flame swaying in the wind. The fire pit. This was also Xiao Xuan's first time to see the tribe's fire pit, which was not even close to the image he had in mind. Xiao Xuan had questioned why the tribe's fire pit would be located at the mountaintop. After all, it was the coldest place in the whole mountain. What's more, there was already a well-developed fire maker. Why bother to keep a fire pit? Everyone spoke with extreme reverence when they talked about the fire pit. And the way they looked at the mountaintop was with unshakable devotion. He had heard from people in the tribe that the fire pit was connected with the tribe's prosperity. As for how they were connected, Xiaoxuan had never heard a word. Now, he may find an answer with his own eyes. The big empty space on the mountaintop was enough for everyone in the tribe to stand on. The crater had a radius of 4 or 5 meters, but the flame burning in the middle was just like normal candlelight. It was not bright, and it seemed like it could easily be blown out by the wind. Also, inside the fire pit, Xiaoxuan did not see any wood or anything burnable. Under the flame, there were no combustion-supporting materials. This was an eternal fire in the fire pit. Around the fire pit, there a circle of man-height thick timber piles. A stone bowl was placed on top of every timber pile. Fresh meat, fruits and bird eggs were piled up in every stone bowl as sacrificial offerings. Beside the timber piles there were crowds of people standing there. From the discussion around, Xiaoxuan learned that those were the strongest warriors from different hunting teams. Some of them were still young, while the others were middle-aged. In total there were 50 warriors. Their faces were painted with the same lines as those on Ji's face. However, what differed was that the totem on their face was no longer in a single dark color. White and red was mixed up in those lines, and they were dressed up in a grander style. Someone wore a pair of giant antlers on his head, which were much bigger in size than any of the antlers Xiaoxuan had seen others wearing. They nearly covered the warrior's body inside. Aside from the warrior with the supergiant antlers, the other warriors were wearing exaggerated decorations as well. At first, Xiaoxuan assumed that the warriors he saw on his way up were already outstanding on their decorations, but unexpectedly there were some with more garish decorations. Suddenly, the surrounding crowd quieted down. Xiaoxuan looked up. It was the chief and the shaman. People automatically made way for them, being extremely respectful. There were also giant horns on the chief's head, while the shaman had no exaggerated decorations. He was holding a cane, with his back somewhat bent, and wearing a gray animal skin cloak. This was Xiaoxuan's second time seeing the shaman, and he felt that the shaman had not changed much since the last year, when he told him to keep Caesar. The ones following the chief and the shaman were those who received greatest attention during this ceremony. Near 80 kids aged from 10 to 14 followed the chief and the shaman closely, and then stood in line beside the fire pit. Xiaoxuan saw the 4 kids from the orphan cave, including Moer. When they were back in the cave, they were very hot-tempered. However, now they were quiet and calm, standing there in sleeveless tops made from animal skin, with their hair combed and decorated with some bones ornaments. Ever since Xiaoxuan knew them, they had never been more tidy and clean. So many kids this year. Someone whispered beside him. Yeah, I agree. Last year it was only 30, 40 at most. But this year, the number doubled. This is a good sign. With so much fresh blood joining, our tribe will be much stronger and more powerful than before. People were discussing, and the kids around Xiaoxuan also murmured because they all felt envious. Almost everyone wondered when they could stand on the spot by the fire pit themselves. After some time waiting, the preparation work had been finished, and the ceremony began. The chief was a strong warrior named Ao, and people said that his strength ranked in the top 3 among the tribe. Ao delivered a short speech first, about last year's harvest and their hope for the next year, to boost the morale. Xiaoxuan had heard a lot of those similar pep talks during his last life, so he felt no extra excitement. But the people surrounding couldn't be more thrilled, and some of them even yelled with open arms after the chief's speech. All the brats also followed the yelling with their faces flushed. After the chief's speech, the shaman took over. After all, the shaman was supposed to serve as the main character during the ceremony. Nearly 80 kids surrounded the fire pit, and they were standing closer to the center than those fierce warriors standing by those timber piles. The shaman carried his cane and stood at the side of the fire pit with his back bent. He opened his arms and began to sing. The atmosphere of the scene suddenly changed, from the earlier excitement to being tense. Each and every one kept their mouths shut and even their breathing became very careful, as if fearing to affect the singing. Xiaoxuan did not recognize what the shaman sang. It didn't seem to be the language that the people used to communicate throughout the tribe. And the tone sounded weird. However, the weirder thing was still yet to come. Along with the shaman singing, the flame danced and rolled over and over. Without any combustion-supporting materials, the flame grew bigger and bigger. As it spread around, the flame itself grew higher, until the flame extended to the edge of the fire pit and covered the whole crater. The flame itself grew to at least 3 meters high, and in the meantime, on the top of the flame, gradually appeared a picture outlined by flames. It became more and more clear, and was gradually combined with the giant flame down there. The top curved itself symmetrically, and finally formed into two horns, wrapped in dancing flames. That was exactly the totem of the Scorching Horn tribe. There were 3 flames in the fire pit. The first flame, soaring flame. The soaring flame became the totem. As the totem appeared above the fire pit, the totem patterns on the warriors' bodies began to become more obvious. Everyone stared at the direction of the fire pit, and their eyes were filled with reverence. It was completely dark, and the 2 moons were hanging up on the 2 ends of the sky. However, on the mountaintop, it was pretty bright and covered with a color of red because of the dancing flames in the fire pit. The shaman's singing did not stop, yet it grew much louder and more sonorous. Then, sounds of drums joined the singing with a certain rhythm. The percussion of bones and stones could also be heard along the singing. Some people clapping their hand, drums resounding high and low. However, the timbre was totally different from the drum sound that Xiao Xuan had heard during his former life. Bones clicking, stones hitting and drums beating melted together. The male and female warriors standing beside the timber piles began to move and they joined the shaman singing. One by one, they kept a certain distance and circled around the fire pit as they were dancing with their arms and legs. That was the ritual dance that was passed down from the beginning of the tribe's establishment. Xiao Xuan recalled the words of his schoolmate whose major was archaeology. Many tribes have their own styles of ritual dances. That is a very important part in each tribe's ritual. It carries with it the unique decorum of a certain era, and conveys the worship they have towards their tribal ancestors. The ancient dance is not supposed to be delivered or learnt just by any normal person. Ancient traditions must be followed and respected. And now, those who were dancing around the fire pit were all elites in the tribe, and those who had earned the qualification to dance the ritual dance on the ritual activities. Even though some moves seemed to be ridiculous in Xiao Xuan's eyes, it was a great honor that everyone desired to acquire. When back in the cave, Xiao Xuan often heard some kids daydream about becoming one of those ritual dancers someday and dancing during a ritual ceremony. The melody played in the ceremony was incomparably weird, as every individual syllable sounded harsh or dull when it was singled out. However, when combined together, it was perfectly suitable for that certain time, under those certain circumstances. People felt it natural to hear that melody here and now. During this ceremony, the melody and rhythm was supposed to be like that. However, compared with the ritual dance and weird rhythm, Xiao Xuan cared more about the kids standing by the fire pit. As the picked-out warriors were dancing the ritual dance surrounding the fire pit, the flames in the fire pit grew bigger and bigger, and then many flames flew out from there. Yes, flew out. One after another, sparks and flames flew out from the fire pit and they floated in the air. The second flame of the fire pit, flying flame. However, the kids standing near the fire pit did not try to avoid, but kept standing there respectfully and let those sparks and flames float down onto their bodies. Xiao Xuan stared at that direction with his eyes wide open. The sparks and flames did not burn them as they floated down onto the kids' bodies, and they did not even burn their clothes. It was like the flames and sparks integrated into their bodies directly. With more flames and sparks integrated into their bodies, some kids began to show the special patterns of totemic warriors on their bodies. The more they contacted with the flames and sparks, the clearer and more complete their totemic patterns became. The flying flames did not stop after they made contacts with the kids chosen by the shaman, who stood around the fire pit. Quite a lot flames and sparks also flew around and afar. Some flames and sparkles also flew to the place where Xiao Xuan was sitting at. Seeing the approaching flames and sparks, Xiao Xuan wanted to step aside naturally. However, he forced himself to calm down and remain standing still. Since others did not move, it should be not as harmful as he imagined. Indeed, Xiao Xuan only felt a comfortable feeling of warmth when he was contacted by the flame, with no pain of burning. At that time, Xiao Xuan was fully relieved, so he kept staring at the fire pit, regardless of the fact that more and more flames and sparks flew towards him. The kids around the fire pit were the luckiest ones among the whole year. They would acquire strength and power through the fire pit and awaken their totemic power. He wondered if the 3 kids from Orphan Cave and Mo-Er would be able to successfully awaken their totemic powers this year. As he was gazing at the pond, Tu, who stood right beside Xiao Xuan, suddenly called out his name in a low voice. Ah Xuan. Ah Xuan. What? Xiao Xuan came back to himself and moved his eyesight from the fire pit, only to realize that every kid surrounding him was staring at him as if he was a ghost. What's wrong? Xiao Xuan wondered. He was too enthralled by the fire pit and did not notice his surroundings. The few kids hurriedly stepped backwards, yet still stared at Xiao Xuan in shock. Tu swallowed his saliva and said, You are burning. Burn what? Xiao Xuan was still confused. What were they saying? I wasn't burning. You are burning with fire. Xiao Xuan's first reaction towards Tu's words was rejection. Even if he had been staring at the fire pit and didn't care about the coming flames, it didn't mean he wouldn't notice the pain of fire burning him. What do you mean you are burning? How could you not feel anything if you were burning? Just to be safe, Xiao Xuan watched the sparks and flames come closer, and only shifted his attention after he made sure it was harmless. What's more, all the surrounding people were just fine, and even those kids standing right beside the flame pond were totally okay. And now you bloody told me that I'm on fire. However, even if Xiao Xuan did not believe it at heart, but judging from the looks of the kids around him, there really must be something wrong. He checked his hands, all clear, and there were no visible flames on his legs as well. Ah Xuan, your head on your head. Xiao Xuan hesitated and finally he raised his arm to touch his head. It felt no different. Nothing abnormal. On a second try, there was still no abnormal feeling. His hair was intact, and no smell of burning could be smelt. However, when he looked up, what the FCK? When Xiao Xuan finally saw the fire on his head, it had already grown big. At first, there was only a small flame on his head, but now he was basically wearing a bonfire as a giant hat. Also, with more and more flames and sparks flying towards him, the flame on his head grew bigger and bigger, with a downward spreading trend. Xiao Xuan could clearly feel the fire on his head, and he could also see his bangs being wrapped in flame. However, he felt no pain, and when he touched it with his hand, he felt nothing abnormal. It was useless when he took off his clothes and tapped them on his head. The flame kept spreading downwards and the flying flames and sparks directly melted into Xiao Xuan's arms, legs and torso, with no obvious sign of moving to the head. But, aside from the panic caused by the suddenness in the beginning, Xiao Xuan quickly calmed himself down. This was not the world he knew well, and nothing could be deduced with his original logic and theories. Since the flame was from the fire pit, and he felt no pain of burning, Xiao Xuan stopped using his clothes to put out the fire, and instead, he stood there, trying to think about what he should do next. The people standing in front of Xiao Xuan did not notice his condition, as their attention was totally fixed on the fire pit. However, it was a completely different case for the people standing behind Xiao Xuan. Especially some elderly, who had attended many snow festivals, yet no one had ever witnessed such circumstances as Xiao Xuan was experiencing now. At the meantime, the shaman who was singing by the fire pit also had a minor pause in his singing that no one would notice unless one paid extra attention. After that slight pause, he continued to host the ceremony. He could definitely not leave now, he had to stay right where he was. The ceremony by the fire pit was only finished by 2/3, and the remaining 1/3 of the ceremony was the most important part. Perhaps to most of the warriors in the tribe, the second flame was the most remarkable and conspicuous part among the 3 flames of the fire pit. Because during the second flame, a group of new totemic warriors would appear. All hunting teams which had lost some warriors, focused their attention, waiting to recruit some of the kids there once they turned into totemic warriors. But to the shaman himself, totemic warriors' quantity was only a minor aspect. He wished to see the condition of the final flame. However, even if he could not leave, the shaman would not ignore the things happening in there. So as the shaman kept singing, he winked at Chief Ao's direction. Chief Ao standing there had already noticed the abnormal circumstances at Xiao Xuan's direction, and was hesitating about whether to go there or not. After all, the shaman knew better about rituals than him, and moving without the shaman's permission during a ritual could bring disastrous consequences upon the ceremony. Being the chief of the tribe, naturally he had to consider the big picture and put the tribe's best interest ahead, instead of a single person or some group of people's benefit. Receiving the shaman's wink, the chief hinted others to continue, while he moved his body towards the spot where the abnormal things were happening. Most of the people were gazing at the fire pit, and since the chief's movement was so fast, not many people had realized what had happened. Xiao Xuan was just hesitating on whether to let the flame grow bigger, or shout out for help. Without doubt, Xiao Xuan cherished his life. If it was not the fact that he felt no actual harm, he would have shouted out for help already. However, firstly, the flame did not burn him or bring him actual pain. Secondly, it was after all the annually most important ceremony of the tribe. Even those arrogant warriors suppressed their arrogance and behaved like civilized people. How could he take the hatred from everyone when his shouting sabotaged the great ritual? This was the only tribe in this area, and being all alone in this world, he could not afford to be hated and abandoned. As he was thinking, he felt a shadow in front of him. Xiao Xuan looked up and just saw the chief's curious eyes. There were so many people on the mountaintop. Xiao Xuan had heard no steps or people moving to clear a path, yet the chief silently appeared in front of him. He was just beside the fire pit. The surrounding kids were rather nervous and their attention had long since moved away from the fire pit. They could not awaken their totemic powers anyway this year, so Xiao Xuan's accident right under their noses certainly seemed to be more attractive. Now since the chief had come, obviously Xiao Xuan was in a great trouble as far as they were concerned. Chief. Ji noticed the situation and before he could say anything, he was stopped by Ao. Ao raised his hand to show that others shouldn't be distracted by them. The surrounding people hurriedly focused their concentration and looked at the fire pit again. In their hearts they prayed that the coming year would promise more game and everything would go smoothly. Among them, surely there were some with less concentration, those would constantly glimpse at Xiao Xuan's direction with irrepressible curiosity. Ao looked at the kid in front of him, filled with curiosity as well. Is he awakening his totemic power? That kid was absolutely less than 11 years old, and compared with the kids around the fire pit, he appeared to be much weaker. During the pre-selection, he had seen every kid brought from the Mountain Foot district, yet he had no memory of this little kid. Apparently this was also the chief's first time in meeting up with such circumstances. However, since the shaman had given an order, all he had to do was to take the kid to the shaman. Don't be afraid, for the flame doesn't harm anyone. Ao comforted Xiao Xuan in a low voice, and then lifted him up by the animal skin clothes he was wearing. Earlier Xiao Xuan was thinking with his head bowed so he did not notice how the chief got here from the fire pit. But now he knew. Ao jumped up directly and stepped on the shoulders of the audience. He seemed tall and strong, but the movements of his were quite lissome. He lifted Xiao Xuan, yet he acted as if he and Xiao Xuan were as light as a feather as he jumped over the people in the tribe. Before Xiao Xuan could catch his breath, they had arrived and landed by the fire pit. Ao told Xiao Xuan to stand among the other kids and then stepped backwards to his original spot. Adding another kid by the fire pit naturally drew the attention of the people who were staring at the fire pit all the time. Some tried to whisper a thing or two with the one standing beside them, but a look from Ao quickly straightened them out. Some young warriors dancing the ritual dance almost missed a step because of distraction. But they quickly cursed in their heart, focused their mind again, and carefully continued to do the ritual dance. However, many people could not fight the curiosity they had in their hearts. Is the kid added to the group also awakening his totemic power? Why was he not chosen during the pre-selection? Too young at age. People did not question the shaman's ability, so they guessed the fault was with the age. Aside from age, perhaps someone made a mistake when he went down to the mountain to do the preparations. What on earth happened? And why was the kid wearing a ball of fire on his head? Just as people were wondering, Ao looked away from the fire pit as he returned to his spot. He looked down to his hand that held Xiao Xuan earlier. That vigorous big hand that had killed countless game had been burnt red. What was he telling that kid again? The flame doesn't harm anyone. Xiao Xuan's joining in the middle was merely a small episode of this year's ceremony, even though it was obviously different from other ceremonies. However, even if people in the tribe had their own guesses at heart, their most concerning thing now was still about the awakening kids around the fire pit. Sai was extremely thrilled as he carefully experienced the obvious changes in his body, and the totemic patterns which appeared on his arms. But naturally, he also noticed that someone suddenly joined them out of the blue. Sai slightly turned his head to take a look, only to find out that it was Xiao Xuan, covered in a ball of fire. It was a small world where enemies often crossed each other's path. Isn't that fellow still too young? He is only supposed to be 10 years old after today's snow festival. Why is he here? Seeing Xiao Xuan standing right next to himself, who was 2 years younger, Sai's heart rate raced up apprehensively. Every time when Sai thought about having been beaten up by Xiao Xuan and the others in the cave before winter, he would get quite angry. In fact, he was quite excited when he was chosen by the shaman this year. He planned to bring back some ferocious beast when he went on a mission with his new hunting team after awakening his totemic power, and then take its body to the entrance of Orphan Cave so those little bastards would be able to see his game closely, especially Xiao Xuan. But now, what was happening? Xiao Xuan also noticed that he was standing right next to Sai the minute he was tossed here. However, now he had no interest in dealing with him. Before, he could only observe the fire pit from afar, and now Xiao Xuan finally was able to feel the tribal fire pit closely. He felt like he was surrounded by a sea of fire, but with no feeling of burning. All that he felt was warmth, and the warmth had driven away all the coldness left in his body by the winter. The totemic pattern on the kids standing around the fire pit appeared to be fiery red. It became like that after the flames had entered their bodies, they awakened the strength that was hidden within their flesh. And the process was clearly more restrained. However, Xiao Xuan's changes were much fiercer. The fire which originally gathered on his head now had spread down to his body. Xiao Xuan's eyesight was filled with fire. The only thing he was not sure of was whether it was the fire on his head or the fire flown over from the fire pit. Xiao Xuan felt some pain in his brain, and also his body temperature rose up, with heat gathering at his glabella, and then spreading to his forehead, face, neck, torso, and limbs. With no mirror, Xiao Xuan could not see the changes on his face, but seeing that fire-red totemic patterns existed on the other kids' faces, he assumed that the same must have happened on his face. Feeling the heat stretching from his shoulder down to his limbs, Xiao Xuan turned his sight to his arms. Earlier, he took off his animal skin coat in order to put out the fire, and then left it there without putting it back on. So now, Xiao Xuan was only wearing a sleeveless sweater made from animal skin. The totemic patterns appeared on his arms together with the spreading heat. They could be seen quite clearly. The flames and sparks flowing from the fire pit became denser as time went by, and the flame inside the fire pit had a trend of spreading out. Everyone in the tribe was busy praying, so Xiao Xuan covered in fire stood out less. The dancing flames in the fire pit grew more and more violent. The fire pit now was no longer that large crater with a small fire that Xiao Xuan saw at first. Now the whole fire pit was like a big volcano, waiting to erupt. However, it was not dreadful like before, but people felt the urge to worship when seeing the fire pit like that. The shaman singing had reached the third stage, and at the final syllable, the shaman raised up his arms and suddenly moved away his hand. The gray and white animal skin cloak instantly got flooded by the spreading out flames. Third flame of the fire pit, spreading flame. The flames in the fire pit had just a gentle change, but now the flames no longer flew out. Instead, the fire poured out like lava and instantly flooded everyone at the ceremony, and then without stopping, it went towards the mountain foot area. Near the mountain foot area, Caesar, who was left in the cave because of the ritual ceremony, stared at the entrance of the cave with growling sounds coming from his throat. Outside the cave, it was covered by fire. The quickly spreading flames covered the whole mountain, but didn't burn any straw or tree. It seemed that the flame was not lethal at all, but Caesar hiding in the cave feared it a lot. If possible, he would literally dig down under the ground and hide there. And, the night swallows which had already retreated to the edge of residential area, reluctantly flew up and went further away seeing that approaching fire. The shaman was standing beside the fire pit, with a serious look all the time. However, now, he finally showed a joyful smile. There was no need to look down the mountain, yet he could already feel where the flames had reached. The expansion scope was a lot larger than the last few years. In fact, ever since he took place as the shaman in the tribe, he had never seen any third flame of the fire pit reach such a large scope. It was a good omen. Luck. The shaman shouted. Luck. Everyone in the tribe followed the shout with cheer. The flame of the scorching horns may never die. Chief Ao also joyfully shouted out. The flame of the scorching horns may never die. People in the tribe echoed loudly. Every single one of them was more than excited. Since the shaman claimed that the coming year would be a lucky one, it surely will be. How could they not to get thrilled and excited? The spreading flame lasted for about half an hour, and then it began to fade away from the mountain. In the end, only the flames inside the fire pit kept burning and dancing, and the totem above that flame existed all the time. After that, the atmosphere became lighter and less serious. The scene was filled with joy and people were quite relaxed. Since people in the tribe needed to vent out their excitement, they all went down the mountain in small groups, laughing, chatting, and planning to have a barbecue party with their close friends and families after they got home. They would have some fruit wine and after that they would have a good sleep, and wait for the promising new year to come. Ji also led the kids down the mountain to the orphan cave. They did not worry about getting attacked by night swallows that evening. Because besides for Caesar, no wild birds or animals would be able to enter their residential area. Unlike most of the people in the tribe, Xiao Xuan and the other kids who had awakened their totemic powers had to stay, and they will have to stay up in the mountain for some time because they had to listen to the shaman's second lecture. Nearly 80 kids were standing beside the fire pit, and most of them awakened their totemic powers successfully, except for 4 of them. Those 4 kids left with disappointment, but thinking about the fact that they would definitely awaken their totemic powers next year, they were less depressed already. Xiao Xuan and the others stayed beside the fire pit. And after everyone else in the tribe had gone, they were brought into a stone house by a few warriors. That stone house was much more firm and solid than the wooden houses that Xiao Xuan had seen down the mountain. Also it was quite large, for it had enough room for over 70 kids. After their totemic powers awakened, their breath seemed to become easier than before. Every piece of muscle and every single bone in their body seemed to be reformed, and they were filled with endless strength. Even if they looked the same as before, the inner part of themselves had changed essentially. However, Xiaoxuan was still a little upset and gloomy. The other kids were either discussing about their feeling of awakened totemic powers, or trying to gesture with each other because of excitement. If it weren't for the situation that someone was watching, they would have started competing with each other instantly. After he had carefully looked at the others around him for a few times, Xiaoxuan stepped forward a few steps and poked on the one who was bragging to the other kids. "Hey, you." "What?" Sai got interrupted and he turned around, but instantly he took a step back vigilantly, after seeing that it was Xiaoxuan. Perhaps he felt ashamed by his own action, so he stepped forward again. "What?" asked Sai, and in his eyes there were still traces of precaution. Before he awakened his totemic power, he was already much taller and stronger than Xiaoxuan, yet he got beaten up by him several times, so now with awakened totemic power, he still dared not underestimate him. "After you awakened, did you notice any changes in your vision?" "Vision is how you see things. Do you feel any changes from before?" asked Xiaoxuan. Seeing Xiaoxuan was only asking such questions, Sai kept his jaw up high and said with pride, "Sure I do." Other kids that Xiaoxuan did not know before also joined the discussion, since they overheard Xiaoxuan's question. They kept talking about how far they could see in dark situations, and compared with earlier, their hearing, smelling and vision had greatly improved with their totemic powers awakened. Xiaoxuan was the only one who remained silent. He had to remain silent, or else could he tell the others that all the people he set his eyes on were skeletons. At the end of the ceremony, Xiaoxuan felt that something was wrong. Before he realized it, the totemic patterns on his body were almost complete. He had been staring at the flames inside the fire pit. Since he knew that all the changes on his body were because of the awakened totemic power, he didn't worry about it anymore. However, ever since he stood by the fire pit, he felt an odd sense of intimacy with the flame inside. He did not know if it was a common feeling for all the kids who were awakening their totemic powers. At that moment it was impossible for him to ask someone in detail, so he kept staring and studying the flames inside the fire pit. By the time the shaman announced the end of the ceremony, Xiaoxuan withdrew his attention from the fire pit. He was planning to joke with his sworn rival Sai, who was standing beside him. He looked at Sai, but to only find a skeleton standing right next to him. Xiaoxuan was nearly scared to death. He almost reflexively kicked him away. Looking around, all the people who were walking and the warriors that finished the ancient dance, together with every kid standing around the fire pit, turned into skeletons in his eyes. He could no longer recognize who was who. All the ones talking, walking and swinging their arms and legs, all became skeletons. Xiaoxuan was stupefied. He did not know if it was just him, or was it the same case with all totemic warriors. Back when he was chatting with Lang Ga and Mai, the only thing he knew about totemic power was that once the power was awakened, one's body strength and reaction speed would greatly improve. However, he never asked about whether they could see skeletons. Who would have thought of that? However, now, Sai and the other little warriors did not mention anything about skeletons at all. A minute earlier they were discussing about the meat jerky that was hanging outside the stone room, and never did they mention a thing about bones. So it seemed that he was the only exception. He was experiencing the same process of awakening, yet after his totemic power was awakened, it was not the same as everyone else. What if he could only see skeletons from now on? Will he dream only about skeletons, and will the people in his dreams become walking skeletons? Screw this. He felt terrified even thinking about it. Xiaoxuan scratched his head. He was seeing his arm as bones without flesh at all. What the FCK? As for recognizing Sai earlier, it was because he felt familiar with him, since they had fought each other several times in the past. Also, Xiaoxuan recognized his voice. That little bastard was never shy when he bragged about himself. From the beginning he was in an extreme excitement since he successfully awakened his totemic power. He kept his voice high and sharp, as if fearing that others might not be able to hear him. If it weren't for these two reasons, Xiaoxuan could not have recognized him so soon. The warriors that led them here had already left, while the shaman and the chief had not arrived yet. Right now, inside the stone room, there were only those 75 kids who just awakened their totemic powers this year. With no supervision, those kids fully liberated their nature. They began to laugh and chat in small groups. In the eyes of Xiaoxuan, they were all skeletons with their mouths opening and closing and limbs moving around. Xiaoxuan did not join the crowd. Ever since he knew there was something wrong with him, he stepped down to a corner, thinking silently. He had taken off the pallet that had his name from his neck. He remembered that none of the kids standing around the fire pit had worn it. So he tied his pallet on his wrist and stepped inside the room. He had no feeling of discomfort from his body, and all his hair remained intact, even though there was a ball of fire on his head earlier. Not only this, Xiaoxuan felt totally relaxed and comfortable. He felt very energetic, perhaps the reason being that he awakened his totemic power. If he could see something other than skeletons, he would be in a much better mood. Since he could not figure out the reason for what was happening, Xiaoxuan looked around the room. Aside from those over 70 skeletons, there was nothing inside but stones. Stone table, stone stools, and many stones in different sizes and shapes on the stone table. In fact, in Xiaoxuan's sight it wasn't just only a single color. Instead, in his sight he could see white, gray and black with different shades. For example, those lead skeletons were white, while the stones varied from pale gray to dark gray. Because of fear and respect towards the shaman and the chief, those young warriors did not touch those stones on the table. However, they were always free to watch. Next to the long square stone table stood a few kids. They were discussing the ranking of the stones. "This stone looks fine enough, certainly it could be made into a nice stone knife," a kid said as he pointed at a stone on the table. "That is okay, I suppose it is close to the mid-level." Another kid took a closer look at it then said. One could tell from his tone that he did not care much about that stone. A mid-level stone did not seem to be special to him. However, when he saw some stones in an irregular shape, he sounded pretty surprised. "This one is good. Perhaps an upper mid-level, unfortunately the shape is irregular, and it can't be made into a knife. It could barely be made into a middle-sized spearhead." Xiaoxuan looked their way and realized that the mid-level stone in their discussion appeared in his sight to be gray, while the upper mid-level one was close to dark gray. In order to prove whether the theory in his heart was correct, Xiaoxuan stood there as he listened to those kids evaluating the ranking of the stones on the table. Those unappreciated stones, the so-called inferior stones, appeared to be pale gray in Xiaoxuan's sight, while the mid-level stones were gray, and the ones with better quality had darker color. In other words, the better the quality of the stone, the darker it would appear to be in this special vision. Xiaoxuan thought in his heart. As the discussion in the stone room went on, the curtain was lifted, and the shaman walked in with a cane in his hand. Together with shaman, Chief Ao and 2 other warriors also came inside. One of the warriors was a woman. When the curtain was lifted, it immediately became quiet in the room. The ones who were showing off their knowledge a minute ago immediately became obedient, and they prostrated themselves before the shaman respectfully. While he lived near the Mountain Foot district, Xiaoxuan had rarely seen someone give a salute. Normally people in the tribe would only give a salute when seeing someone with a high reputation. However, people living down the mountain were basically nobodies, so normally Xiaoxuan did not see anyone giving a salute to other. However, Xiaoxuan knew how to give a proper salute anyway. Aside from showing kids how to count and write, the man in charge of teaching in the orphan cave would also show them how to give a salute. In fact, if you live in the cave, you may not know how to count or write, but you must learn how to give a salute. When meeting the shaman, those who did not salute were considered disrespectful, and would be despised and rejected by the people in the tribe. The shaman guarded the fire pit until the flame shrank to its original size, and then he came to the stone room slightly tired. Probably, hosting tonight's ritual ceremony cost him a lot of strength and energy, as the shaman was being assisted as he came inside. After the end of the ceremony by the fire pit, the shaman came over and only drank some water. He had no further knowledge about the little warriors that awakened tonight, and neither had he the chance to take a look at the animal skin roll that had all their information on it. He came to the stone room directly after he caught his breath. Chief Ao came in together with the shaman. After glancing around the room, he fixed his eyes on Xiaoxuan. The red burning mark had not faded away from his hand, and he did not find the proper time to discuss it with the shaman. A warrior moved a stone stool and placed it in the center of the room, while the female warrior helped the shaman over to the center where he sat down. The shaman was panting for breath as he looked at tonight's newly awakened little warriors dotingly, feeling especially gratified. Every year when he saw the newly awakened warriors, he would feel irresistible pride. "Good, very good. You are all going to be the real fierce warriors of our Scorching Horn tribe," the shaman said slowly. Being praised and acknowledged by shaman, all the kids blushed. They could not wait to shout in order to express and vent their excitement. Looking around, the shaman asked, "Who is the kid that joined the crew last? Come here and let me have a look at you." Those who stood in front of Xiaoxuan immediately stepped aside. Other than Xiaoxuan, all the kids had spent some time at the shaman's place. Therefore, they had impressions about each other. Xiaoxuan was the only exception that they did not know. "Ah, it's you? Come closer and let me have a look at you." The shaman looked at Xiaoxuan and said. Xiaoxuan stepped forward and stood in front of the shaman. He was curious about what this old shaman might say. Would he mention Caesar? Did he feel guilty about ignoring him for nearly a year? Didn't he know how difficult it was to keep a wolf? Xiao Xuan gazed at the old skeleton sitting on that stone stool, and the shaman stared at Xiao Xuan attentively as well. He asked in the same benevolent and gratified way, "You. What's your name?" Xiao Xuan was speechless for a moment. Apparently, this old shaman did not recognize him. "My name is Xuan." Xiao Xuan shared his name in this life. He now could only see skeletons, so he could no longer analyze the shaman's facial expression. However, seeing that the shaman's skull hesitated at his name as if recalling something, Xiao Xuan knew that this old shaman probably did not recognize him anyway. After some time, the shaman spoke again, but this time he did not ask anything else about Xiao Xuan. "Fine. Now stand with your companions." Xiao Xuan said no more, and even though he showed no dissatisfaction on his face, he was curling his lips in his mind already. Was it true that this old shaman was too old to remember things? Okay, since all of you have awakened your totemic powers and gained the strength coming along with it. So, the first thing you should master now is how to use such strength. The shaman said with no hurry. This is a turning point in your life. After today, you will be regarded a real totemic warrior. However, this is also a fresh new beginning for all of you. You can only rely on yourselves when it comes to how far you can reach in your lives. Never be complacent, for you are the only one to decide whether you stay in the primary stage or continue to grow and develop, just like the other excellent warriors in our tribe. As the shaman was saying this, he looked at Chief Ao's direction as if saying that, "Look, your chief is a fine example of that." Being the chief in the tribe, Ao's ability was indeed outstanding, and he could best most of the warriors in the tribe. Because of the worship to strength, many newly awakened totemic warriors would consider Ao as an idol. And this year's newly awakened totemic warriors were no exception. As totemic warriors, you should first know how to find the source of power inside your bodies. That was also the main reason why the shaman kept those little warriors for tonight. The source of power exists in your bloodline. It is asleep when you are young until someday when the time is right, it gradually awakens under the summon of the flames. Now, close your eyes and clear your minds. Follow the power inside your bodies, and naturally you will see it. No one knew when, but it became warmer inside the stone room. Everyone sat down on the ground and closed their eyes under the shaman's command. Xiao Xuan did the same. When his mind was cleared, he realized that in the sea of his consciousness there was gradually a pattern forming. It was two horns covered in flames, the totem of the tribe. Aside from that, there was also a thing in the shape of an egg, wrapping the totem inside with a dazzling white light. In the shape of an egg. I saw it. A kid could not suppress his excitement and opened his eyes. "It's the totem," said another kid. "I've seen it too." "So did I." Almost all the kids claimed one after another, as if being afraid to be treated as a moron who could not see the source of power by the shaman. None of them wanted to be considered as some stupid totemic warrior with no potential. The shaman looked around and realized that most of the kids could find their sources of power, except for Ah Xuan. "Have you found yours?" As the shaman spoke, all the other kids fixed their attention on Xiao Xuan. Earlier when they were chatting with each other, they had heard from Sai that this kid named Xuan came from the orphan cave down the mountain, and he would only be 10 years old after the snow festival. Normally, only a small number of kids in the tribe could awaken their totemic powers at such a young age, and most of them were descendants from powerful totemic warriors that lived up near the mountaintop. There was a saying spread among the tribe that the earlier one awakened his totemic power, the more potential he would have. And hence he would have more chance than others to become a great warrior like the chief. Before, when winter was not over yet and they got chosen and kept by the shaman, the youngest kid among them was the first grandson of the chief, Mao. The hunting weapon that Chief Ao usually used was a spear, which was also known as Mao in local language. Numerous beasts got killed by Ao's spear, and the spear represented the countless glorious deeds of Ao, as was known to many people in the tribe. And according to the tradition passed along in the tribe, it meant a lot since Chief Ao named his first grandson the same name as the weapon he used. Obviously he had great hopes placed on this grandson. However, apparently during this year's sacrificial ceremony, the one in the center of the limelight was not Mao, who was considered as the one with greatest potential by the public. Instead, it was Xiao Xuan, who got noticed during the middle of the ceremony like a black horse. Mao made a sour face all the time, especially when he looked at Xiao Xuan. In his eyes there were obvious traces of provocation, and he was anxious to start a fight with him. Unfortunately, Xiao Xuan could only see people as skeletons, so he could not see his expression at all. As for the provocating look that Mao kept for so long, it completely went to waste as if it was a look tossed to a blind person. At the shaman's question, Mao stared at Xiao Xuan as well, expecting him to say no, so that Xiao Xuan would definitely receive the mock from everyone in the room. Too bad, But Xiao Xuan did not fulfill their wishes. Xiao Xuan nodded at shaman's words. I've seen it too. It's just the same as the totem that appeared above the fire pit. The shaman was satisfied, since all the kids found their source of power. So he continued to ingrain them with knowledge about the source of the flame. While Xiao Xuan closed his eyes and continued to look at the egg in his mind. Since no one else mentioned something aside from the totem, so it meant that white egg was only existing in Xiao Xuan's mind. Based on that shape, Xiao Xuan couldn't help but think about the odd stone that he picked up from his last life, the one that could not be scratched with a knife and could not be heated up by fire. The more he looked at it, the more it looked like the stone from his previous life. If it's true, then he found the reason why he was experiencing a different process of awakening compared with the others. Speaking of using the totemic power, the shaman asked Mao to demonstrate for the kids. Give a punch without using totemic power. Another warrior took out a previously prepared slate under the command of the shaman. Mao stood out with pride. Seeing his own grandfather Ao, the chief of the tribe, looking at him with encouragement, Mao took a deep breath, made a fist, and stood in the right position. He roared as he punched against the slate in front of him with his clenched fist. Bang! A dull thud. The slate shook slightly. Mao frowned a little and pulled back his fist. Xiao Xuan could nearly feel his pain, but looking at Mao's fist, Xiao Xuan noticed that he was not injured, only a red mark was left on his hand. That was exactly the difference of the body's strength after awakening the totemic power. From flesh to bones, every inch of one's body got strengthened. Okay, now do it again, but his time with the totemic power. The shaman said. Mao stopped frowning, he looked much more relaxed. On his face, totemic patterns appeared, as he punched again. With the same gesture and, as it seemed, the same strength. It felt all the same, yet it felt completely different somehow at the same time. Bang! The slate got punched and broke into pieces. Those little warriors instantly got excited and they wanted to have a try for themselves. However, the shaman did not intend to take out more slates. Instead, he asked them to do silent practice in their minds in order to get familiar with how to use the totemic power. After delivering the lecture, the shaman took the men and left, for now he had to get some rest. Seeing the exhausted shaman, Ao took another look at his red palm. Thinking it over a bit, he decided to discuss it tomorrow. The shaman was assisted back into his stone room. With an animal fur blanket on his body, he opened a roll of animal skin by the firelight. He told someone to make a record of today's ritual ceremony, in which there were all detailed information about every kid. It had all things written down, like who got awakened first and who completed the awakening first. In the animal skin roll, there was also information about Xiao Xuan, including his birth and his current living situations. Seeing that Xiao Xuan kept a wolf, the shaman searched his memory hard. Of course. No wonder he felt a sense of familiarity when he heard the name Xuan. Back then, when he was walking around the Mountain Foot district to see how the people's lives were, he did not expect to hear anything about keeping and breeding. So when he met Xiao Xuan with the little wolf, he left a pattern plate so that no one in the tribe would harm the little wolf. Originally he planned to provide an extra portion of food to Xuan. However, after he got back to the mountaintop district, he was told that a certain kind of plant he had been searching for a long time was found, and a hunting team brought back one plant alive. So he devoted all his thoughts and energy to the research, and he had been working on that plant for nearly a year. Finally, he found out a way of grinding it into a herb. When the prescription was finalized, he completely forgot about the little wolf that he asked Xiao Xuan to keep. He wondered how the little wolf was now. While at that time, Caesar, who eventually got remembered by the shaman, was just squatting outside the orphan cave pathetically. With icy winds at night, he stared at the mountaintop and howled. Like and subscribe.